Kommer det ikke inn en moderator først, eller? Ja.
On behalf of our team at SANA and Arkivet, it is my pleasure to welcome speakers and participants from both South Africa and Norway to this partnered webinar between SANA and Arkivet. My name is Kristin Andersen Maharaj, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Education at the University of Agder. I'm also an advisor to the board of the South African Norwegian Association, also known as SANA. The former First Lady Michelle Obama once said that the measure of any society is how it treats its women and girls. And in SANA and Arkivet, we believe that universities have an important role to play in leading the change when it comes to gender equity and gender-based violence. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mr. Solly Moeng. He is an experienced holistic brand manager and media professional with specialization in reputation management, stakeholder engagement strategies, strategic communications, PR, and media relations. More recently, he lectures social, company, and state protocol at the EU Business School. And I now hand you over to Mr. Solly Moeng.
Hi, thank you very much, Kristin. Good afternoon, everybody. So just after 3 p.m. in South Africa on a Friday. I don't know, this topic keeps coming up every year. We seem to be standing in the same place year after year after. It's become like an annual festival, right? It comes, we talk about it for a few days, and then we move on, and then the same things that we keep trying to change keep happening. We see the stats. In South Africa, it's a very sorry state. I mean, those of you who have lived here, who've seen the stats, who've seen the reports, it's almost like, as I say, like an annual festival. At universities, of course, there are specific stories. There are stories of whether or not South African universities deal with the issue of gender equality and GBV, gender-based violence, as effectively as it should. There's sometimes suspicion that some universities are too kind to perpetrators. And so there's a lot of stuff that needs to come out here. But I would like us to have a discussion that will not only just paint a picture that we already know. I think I'm looking forward to seeing at the end of the discussion some kind of solution, something that hopefully will also be used to influence policymakers, decision makers, so that if we have this discussion again next year, we will be able to say this is what we agreed should happen last year, and so much of it has happened, rather than pretend as if we're starting over each time we do it. So anyway, we're going to have maybe 3 or 4 speakers at a time, and then we'll have a Q&A so that we allow our audience to participate, to ask questions. I think a lot of times, if you ask people to invest so much time in a discussion, they don't want to sit there and just listen. I mean, a lot of the people who would be interested in this kind of topic, they've got great views, great commentary to make that I think should be taken on board. So, without wasting any more of your time, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask Professor Sunniva Whitaker from the University of Agder. She's going to be our first speaker. She has about, how many minutes do you have, Prof? About 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to just say your opening remarks, and then we'll move to the next speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to join you here at these webinars organized by SANA. I thought I would focus on two things. One of them is how we deal with gender equality and gender-based violence within our university institutions. And the second, some reflections on our role in society when it comes to raising awareness about these issues. When it comes to the first part, how do we deal with this within our organizations? All Norwegian universities have a plan of action for gender equality and equality in general and diversity. And my predecessor, Rector Frank Reichert, took the initiative to organize a huge survey on sexual harassment in the higher education system some 3 years ago. And 26 higher education institutions actually joined, and there was a questionnaire that was sent to about 42,000 faculty members at all higher education institutions in Norway. And the response rate was more than 40s. And I found that it was quite interesting to see that that sexual harassment wasn't the most prevalent form of harassment. In fact, most people reported on other types of harassment that weren't really defined, but I would assume that this has to do with more like academic bullying, in a sense. Questioning people's academic qualifications, not including them in research groups, and so on and so forth. And in this survey, actually, the people who reported the most bullying or harassment were people in the age bracket 50 to 59. So sexual harassment was not really very prevalent. There were about 1.6% of those who responded actually reported that they had experienced sexual harassment over the last 12 months. And about twice as many women as men, actually. And 18 of the 18,000 who responded reported that they had been victims of sexual abuse. So the backdrop of this survey was obviously the Me Too campaign and an increased awareness about these issues in Norway, as in many other countries. In the survey, the institutions were also asked about what types of actions they had put in place, what type of reporting systems they had. And most of them were quite well equipped when it came to reporting systems. But it remains a problem, obviously, because within a university, there is an power imbalance, which makes particularly maybe PhD students vulnerable in a situation with more qualified or higher ranked academics. So it is a question that we address on a regular basis. We have a reporting system within our university where such cases can be reported. Some prefer to report anonymously, but that makes it very difficult for us to actually take action in the particular case. But I do feel that there is quite a high awareness in this sense. But the second issue on what our role is in society, I think, is really important, because we have seen a trend in Norway of new forms of sexual abuse through social media, through Snapchat and other. There was a case that was reported yesterday, actually, on a 16-year-old boy who threatened young girls to perform sexual acts on themselves. And threatening to expose pictures of these girls in the nude. And I think this is a new trend where we see actually minors who engage in this type of things. And they're obviously legally not allowed to engage in sexual actions. And this has become quite a large problem, I think, through the use of social media. In addition to some more sort of traditional forms of sexual abuse, if I can say it that way. And this is something that we are concerned about as well. We have a huge teacher training program at our university, and we have a PhD student who is actually addressing this to see how teachers can discuss these type of, let's say, taboo subjects with their pupils in a way that is considered or in a way that makes them change their attitudes. And I think this is really an important work, and may probably be integrated into the teacher training programs more broadly in the future. Yeah, I had something else to say, but it just dropped out of my mind at the moment. But I think these two things are extremely important. Yeah, so I think I'll just leave it at that, saying that the Me Too, the whole Me Too campaign has raised awareness in Norway about things that we weren't really aware of before. And the universities definitely have an important role to play, both within our organizations, but also to change attitudes within Norwegian society. And I would also like to add that we have a research environment and a study program at our university on sexology. And one of the professors there has coined a phrase which is sort of a sexual code of ethics, and that, you know, everyone should be aware of this sort of sexual code of ethics in a way, how to react to others, how to respond, how to respect people's boundaries, because I think this has become quite a large problem. Maybe particularly so in a country in Norway where which is quite open when it comes to sexuality, and I think that many girls are maybe pressured into things that they weren't really willing to do, and are afraid of being perceived as prudes or uncool in a way. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and particularly towards young people in the age from 12 to 18. I think this is an age where youngsters are particularly vulnerable. So I think definitely there's a job to do in all countries, also in Norway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like us to take two more speakers before we open up for a little discussion, if you want question and A. So let's go to Professor Mawak. Mr. Lawak, Ms.
Thank you very much, moderator.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sanjay, for once again inviting me to one of Sana's webinars. It's always a pleasure to participate in your webinars, and also lovely to be in the company of such distinguished panelists as we have here today. I want to do a disclaimer to say that what I'm about to share is really my own perspective based on my experience and things I've witnessed and worked on. And I am not a specialist in gender law or anything like that. I'm a payment systems and banking lawyer. So that there goes my disclaimer. Anyone that's been vaguely connected or has, like we live in South Africa, it's something that we've grown up with and very familiar, and it almost sometimes becomes something that people take for granted. But we live in a very patriarchal society, and it occurs everywhere, even in our places of work, including at our universities, irrespective of level. And this is something that I've, right through my working career, consistently called out if I see it, if I become aware of it, and because it has so many faces. When it comes to the issue of gender inequality, it manifests itself sometimes overtly, sometimes in very subtle ways, and I've seen also in our universities it can be entrenched systemically. And what is interesting for me to notice, however, the years where I've worked in the private sector as well in the university, and I can say that there's really no big difference because you get patriarchy everywhere and the levels of gender inequality. I'll give you and I'm sure all of you will have a tea story. This is my one tea story. When I was at the South African Reserve Bank, I was the only woman lawyer dealing in my field. And as we were having tea, the PA came in and she said, "Can you please pour the tea for the men?" And she could not understand why I refused to pour the tea for the men. And I said, all of them can pour their tea. Now, it might seem like a supercilious or a silly story to you, But there are many women that have so bought into traditional gender roles that it's okay only for a woman to pour the tea, and that have bought into patriarchy and in a sense also enable. So there are many sides to this. If I have to, I think the last time we spoke about, so I don't want to really separate gender inequality from GBV. I want to put them both together and then at the end make a few suggestions, both from the perspective of where I'm leading from at my university, but also about things that I think we as universities can do together. So as to GBV, this is a scourge in our society. And you are right, Solly. We will have another webinar. And last year we had the webinar on GBV inequality during COVID-19 pandemic, and we focused on that. We also did one, which I will speak about, at our university last year with a broader South African audience. And depending on which report you look at, you will get different statistics, because there's also, it's well known in our country that it's also highly underreported. So it's not really you always don't get a full sense of the real extent of GBV in South Africa. And with increasing femicide, and Loretta will bear me out here, which was highly publicized, and I think it was in 2019 when one of our own students, JCS, was murdered. It was more or less the same time when Uyanene was murdered at UCT. There was a public outcry amongst higher education institutions, and we had interventions on campus to provide an environment where we're not only aware, but where we can talk, where we can deal with our anger and some action. And then we have this phase where you go on to other things, like you said, and until there's another big murder. So the femicide seems to sort of be more in the public domain and gets a lot more publicity than when other forms of gender violence happens. So when we looked at during COVID-19, with us being mostly remote, it was already evident for us, whilst we have all the policies, sexual harassment and workplace bullying and all of those kind of things in place, but there's been a change because we're not really together. So it makes it even more difficult in terms of reporting and really having a sense of what is happening on campus. And I also mentioned that Jonathan Jansen did a policy briefing to the University of South Africa on the experiences of women academics during the pandemic. And I was interested to then know, okay, so what would it look like at our university? And strangely enough, one of the faculties that had done a survey, whilst the incidences, we weren't clear, so how many incidences there would be on GBV during COVID-19, we knew that women took great strain, that the pandemic is quite gendered. And yet in our latest survey, on the challenges that people mentioned that they're experiencing now, we couldn't really pick up a big difference between what women are experiencing and what our male colleagues are experiencing and what kind of support. So I would actually want to do a follow-up, more broader study to understand, especially around women academics and support staff and how we identify the needs. So when I look at both the issues of gender inequality and GBV, I want to propose, from my perspective, that there are about 7 things that we could do. One is, I'm in a fortunate position that as Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic, I lead the academic project at the University of the Western Cape, which means that we have various ways in which we can also look at this academically and not purely from either a student or staff perspective or an activist perspective, but also from an academic perspective. So one would be for academics to critically engage from an interdisciplinary way, in our case, trying to understand the factors leading to gender inequality, GBV in our society, and in a broader sense, through what I call courageous conversations, which is a methodology I use at UWC, to really come to understand why violence is so endemic in our society and what it is that we can do beyond talking and beyond creating awareness. And then secondly, to role model that it's okay to call out instances of inequality. Because sometimes it happens to you at your level, I've once taken, my colleagues must bear with me, I've taken my bag when I felt that my voice was not heard in the decision, even though we might be a lot of females in leadership. I've taken my bag and I said, when you are interested to hear my opinion and my opinion can count, then I'll come back to university. And I turned around when I was called. So it's calling out that because you can actually be a woman in leadership but not have a voice or not be part of the decision making. Then thirdly, to be aware on and act on any systemic factors, whether it's policies, your institutional culture. If your institutional culture enables gender inequality, if it enables a kind of environment that leads itself to rape culture, then it's something you can't keep a blind eye to that. And to act swiftly when it comes to perpetrators or alleged perpetrators, whether it's on campus or whether, the kind of support that one can give from the university side. Number 4, to ensure that our institutional policies should not impose barriers to gender equality or to provide spaces for rape culture, or what we are now really looking at deeply, the issue of toxic masculinities on campus, which we have a couple of researchers working on that. Number 5, to engage with our judicial system. I sit on the South African Judicial Education Institute Council. And today, when we looked at the training that we give to judges and magistrates on GBV, for example, we realized that some of our regional magistrates are still not properly or correctly applying South Africa's Sexual Offences Act. And so even at the level of the judiciary, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and universities can be involved in that. My second last point is to transform our curricula to include directly dealing with issues of gender inequality, GBV, violence in our society, toxic masculinities. And we've included this as part of our broader social justice principle in a project that I lead, which is on curriculum transformation and renewal. And finally, as UWC is a very strongly engaged university with our communities, we've got a set of principles for community engagement at UWC, and one of our principles is that whenever we engage with our communities, we view our communities as co-creators of knowledge. And this means that if we do research on GBV, gender inequality, or anything else with our communities, we do not research at our communities, but we include them as equal partners, even from framing our research questions, the project and the problem statement, because oftentimes we as university parachute in and parachute out, and there's no ownership in that community where we're trying to solve some part of the problem. I'll leave it at that, Solly. That was my initial input. I'm sure that there will be many other inputs from the panel, and I'd be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Lawak. You were told when I got introduced earlier that I teach etiquette and protocol, but I didn't go into, introducing my speakers in terms of the credentials, spent a lot of time on that, but I hope that you don't mind me just saying Professor Lawak, Professor Ferris, and etc. I believe that all the detailed, profiles of the various speakers are available on the platform. So if you want me to be very detailed in terms of that, let me know. So, ladies and gentlemen, we had a speaker from the University of the Western Cape. We're going to have now somebody from the University of Cape Town, Professor Ferris. And after that, we'll have a little discussion before we continue. Professor Ferris, it is your turn.
Thank you very much, Solly, and thanks to Sana for inviting me to address this as you call it. It's a humongous problem in South Africa, but it's a global problem. It's we're sitting in a pandemic, but actually sexual and gender-based violence is one of a deeply embedded problem in our society, to the point where we can probably also say it's a global pandemic. But we also need to recognize where sexual and gender-based violence in our society stems from. And Vivian has talked about patriarchy. And we need to know that if we want to address and if we want to eradicate gender-based violence, we need to address it as what it is, as social construction, which is premised on the subjugation of women through power and oppression. And these are strong words, but the reality is, as Vivian also has indicated, that patriarchy plays out in ways that is so deeply ingrained in society and in societal relations, and sometimes so subtle that we may not even be aware of the way it influences behavior, including behavior such as sexual harassment and sexual violence towards women in particular. So what is the role of a university? I want to make 5 points by way of introduction that really speaks to the university both being responsible for the students and staff at our campuses, but also more broadly in society. And the first point that I want to make is that a university is in essence a microcosm of society, and what plays out in society plays out on our campuses. But we also know that when students and staff come to campus, they bring with them behaviors that they've learned in their communities or that they've experienced prior to entering universities. So some, for example, are already survivors of gender-based violence. And when we talk to many of our students, we hear these stories. Some of them are dealing with questions about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Others hold patriarchal views that may serve as a catalyst for gender-based violence. What is important, though, is to recognize that while there is this prior experience or embedded values, having all these young people on our campuses is actually an opportunity. It's an opportunity to influence their thinking and to change their behavior that drives sexual and gender-based violence. And if we do this job properly, of influencing thinking and behavior, once students leave the university and they go out into society, hopefully they will replicate these new ways of thinking and being and doing. So we at UCT is, from the moment that students arrive on campus during orientation, we start having these conversations and we confront harmful attitude. But at the same time, we also introduce healthy ways of thinking about topics such as HIV, gender, sexual diversity, but also privilege and class, right? Because all of these are interconnected. And then we try to reach students where they are. We use social media, but we also have a radio station, UCT Radio, where we host radio dialogues on SGBV, on toxic masculinity, on harmful gender norms. And as such, because it's a radio station, it reaches a wider audience, it broadcasts into the Cape Town community. So the Cape Town community then becomes part of these conversations that we have. And I think these kinds of dialogues and seminars and workshops must also be used to engender support by men. And I think that's very important, that men take responsibility for gender-based violence. Because research shows that when men change their own patriarchal views about masculinity, gender-based violence falls dramatically. And as men, they can address common harmful behavior amongst their peers. And with peers, I'm talking about male to male. So one of the programs that we run is the One Man Can program, where we partner with a community-based organization, Sonke Gender Justice. And we've adapted their program to train male students to help prevent gender-based violence. In addition, last year, June, we became the 10th university champion in the He for She campaign. It's a UN global campaign that aims to mobilize 1 billion men to become gender equality change agents. And I would certainly encourage all universities to join this global campaign so that the UN can reach its goal. The second thing I want to say is that regardless of awareness and training, we know that violence is going to occur. Gender-based violence will happen. Vivian talked about how it has played out in extreme ways in 2019 on both our campuses. And of course, as universities, we are responsible for the welfare of our students. And so we must find ways to address the impact of gender-based violence on our students and on staff. And especially supporting the needs of survivors of gender-based violence. And so it's important, I think, that universities have 24/7 emergency services, because we know that gender-based violence takes place any time of the day, but often at night, often over weekends. We also all need to have trauma counseling. I think, those are the two basics. Provide the support, provide trauma counseling, but then also, partner with hospitals, especially hospitals with forensic units for medical care, so that they can provide confidential advice and support for students. They can collect the necessary evidence that may be used in future trials. And then also, where they can, I think universities should provide advice, legal advice, and support with things such as no contact orders, court preparation, and trials. Of course, and this is the third point that I want to make. Whilst I'm saying all of this, I'm very well aware of the fact that having a well-rounded service on gender-based violence and support for survivors requires funding. And that's not easily available in these days of constrained budgets. And so what we have done is we've really relied heavily on strategic partnerships. And so we have partnerships with police services, with counseling services, which ensures that we can kind of expand our own capacity. But it also means that when we are not able to support students and staff, so for example, during the pandemic, and especially during lockdown, we couldn't reach our students and staff all that easily. But we had an instance where a student reached out. She was in a dire domestic violence situation. And because we had this strategic partnership with our local police services and our specialized unit on gender-based violence in place, we could pick up the phone and reach out to them, and they were able to extract the student from the situation. The fourth thing that I want to say is that what is really critical is for complainants to see that justice is being done. And one of the projects that I've driven very strongly is to synergize our student and staff disciplinary processes through the creation of a special tribunal that deals with sexual and gender-based violence. This tribunal has a singular focus on sexual misconduct disciplinary matters, which means that from the evidence leader to the tribunal members, the assessors, everyone has specialized knowledge on gender-based violence. So we're not only able to fast-track these cases, we've also established legal processes and procedures that minimizes the trauma to the survivors and that supports the survivors' right to legal representation, hearings in camera or via Zoom or Teams, etc. And I think that's really critical that we begin to think around the need for more specialized interventions to find support for victims. And then my fifth and final point, Solly, is that as universities, we are in the business of generating knowledge and ideas. And we need to encourage and support research and scholarship on gender-based violence. And I think both Sunniva and Vivian has talked about research. And I want to underscore the importance of it. Because I think research can generate insight into things such as what's driving gender-based violence, or what kind of rehabilitative or restorative justice programs we can work on, how we can improve our work with survivors, or how do we mainstream gender-based violence in our curriculum, or even begin to introduce it in sensitive ways in school curricula, etc. And we also need, I think, better data to understand how and where gender-based violence occurs. I think Sunniva made the point that sometimes survivors report anonymously, and that limits one's ability to intervene in a case. But I think what anonymous reporting also can assist with is the accumulation of data. So one can begin to see, for example, certain perpetrators' names coming up. And so even though you don't have a witness statement, you can begin to see a pattern of behavior with respect to a particular perpetrator. Or, anonymous reporting can indicate to you that there are certain trends, that rape occurs in a certain residence, for example, more often than in another residence. And then that residence is the residence that you need to target for your intervention. So I want to put a high or really want to stress the importance of collecting data. As universities, we have the ability to do so, and I think we should collect data to better understand how and where GBV occurs. And then we need to share our research and our scholarship, make it available so that there are shared understandings and shared approaches to address this problem. I'm going to leave it there, Solly, and of course we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferris. Very interesting point there. Before we move to the next one, I'm not sure. I cannot see the questions from the audience if there are any. Please let me know. If there's a way for me to see them. But I will ask questions. I'm very happy that you mentioned the issue of universities being a microcosm of the society because they are. And if you look at maybe Norway versus South Africa, which is a really complex country with some really instilled traditions. People come to university having come from some very traditional settings in some instances where they have to be men, and to be a man means certain things. It means that you're a man, the woman is down there below you. So you come to these universities and get taught this is how you should do this in order to integrate the modern world as well. But these men, young men, go back to their societies and come under pressure again to be men, and to be men in where they come from. It's not the same thing as to be man in the universities. I think it's very interesting to see. It would be interesting for me to see to what extent the efforts by the universities go beyond that. And there are sensitivities as well. I'm quite aware of that, but we have to challenge them, because some of these cultural sensitivities do result in this kind of discussion, because we are afraid to offend, we are afraid to appear to be insensitive to values or to practices that have been held dearly by communities, by societies for a long time. But how do we open up those discussions as universities? How do universities share knowledge? I like what Professor Lawak also said earlier about her experience at the Reserve Bank. I've had stories of young women saying, but if he slaps me, it means he loves me. If he doesn't slap me, it means that he doesn't care about me. So how do you overcome that? How do you make sure that both sides of the coin are attended to, as it were? I think, I'm not sure what the situation is like in Norway, but it would be interesting to see to what extent what happens on campus is also a reflection of what happens in society. I mean, do people just arrive at campus and suddenly adopt habits and behavior that has nothing to do with where they come from, or are they really always a product of where they come from? I think if you want to take it, any one of you, if you want to respond to any of that, please go ahead. Any one of you who spoke on. Sunniva, Mr. Professor Whitaker, you want to say?
Yes. Well, I totally agree on what Loretta said about the university being a microcosm. And in Norway, let's say about 50% of all young children actually attend university. So it is really a reflection of what's going on in society otherwise. But I would say that the problems in Norway are probably a bit different. What we can say is that men often receive credit for things that you take for granted that a woman would do. For instance, a man who takes care of his children will be praised and said, what a great man, whereas a woman, this will be just invisible work that's done. And I think, your thoughts on, being a man, I think in Norway, people who are very sort of asserting their masculinity will not be looked up to. I would say that men that are very insecure would probably adopt that type of strategy, but it's not what's going to give them credibility or make them popular, in the crowd. Quite the contrary, I would say. And in particular, because at the university level, more than 50% of our students are female. So there is a very clear balance here. So, yes, I think the problems are there, but they're very different in the way they are, in the way they play out. Thank you.
Interesting. Professor Ferris, thank you.
So I want to say to you know that actually, I mean, when Sunniva talks about you know, gender roles and men being praised for taking on what is traditionally assumed to be female work, that they get praised, it actually plays out very much the same, you know, in a South African context. I think that's universal, and it's one of the things that we really need to talk about much more intensely. But I mean, I mentioned briefly that one strategy that we've been adopting is to actually get, I almost want to say, get men on our side, right? Because often when we have these conversations with students, they object very heavily to the fact that they are being blamed, right? So, and actually, we see it on social media when we see, you know, all of these campaigns being driven on social media. You see the comeback, right? Men come back very strongly, and they feel that they taking the blame for what other men are doing, and so we challenge them and we say, well, if you don't want to take the blame, then come and stand with us, walk with us, come and be an activist for gender, to deal with gender-based violence, right. Because often you are much better situated to talk to another man. You know, you are in those spaces, you are in the pub or in the bar. You know, when you see your friend hitting or harassing a woman, you know, you need to call them out. You need to be able to say to them, this is not the way that you should be acting. But what we do is we realize that it's not easy, right? We realize that it's not easy for one guy to call out another guy. And so we help them. We run training programs to kind of give them the words or give them almost the kind of the confidence, right, to speak out against other men. And so I don't want to underestimate the value of getting men to step out and to take responsibility and to take accountability and driving, you know, the campaigns against gender-based violence.
Okay, thank you very much. Both of you still have your hands up. Professor Whitaker, you still have your hand up. But you haven't addressed the issue of cultural ingrained cultural practices, especially in a country like South Africa, because they are a contributor to some of the behavior that we see in men. How does one challenge them without appearing to be defying or disrespecting ingrained cultural practices? That's the one part. And at a global level, the language we speak surely is a problem. I mean, the things that we say to little boys about little girls, some of the things that we say have become so normalized, we don't even see anything wrong with them. I mean, like we hear easily somebody say, "Oh, he's so good, he's gonna get all the girls," you know, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But if you were to say, "Oh, she's so good, she's gonna get all the boys," what would the response be like to that? So these are nuances of the way societies have evolved. And I think that I want to believe that most of the people who are involved in culture, in gender-based violence, are young people. In other words, they are a generation that we must still clean up. But I would be very hurt when if I were to see a 15-year-old, 14-year-old doing the same thing. It means that somewhere we are failing. We have to train young people from the beginning, socialize them into a different outlook. If we not, otherwise they're going to come back and end up at a university. So you're going to find yourself having to do the same thing over and over again, because where it starts, there isn't sufficient work being done to make sure that by the time they get to the universities, the problem is not as big as, it is progressively smaller, as it were. And one last thing. But okay, maybe you go ahead first. Professor Vivian Alawak, you wanted to say something?
Maybe just to latch on to you, I think sometimes we don't really talk about the cultural issues that come to play. I had a colleague who refused to take instructions from a fellow Black African woman because he said he was a prince in his clan, right. But he was quite willing to take instructions from me. And we had to grapple with that, because it's not okay that in the workplace, when this person was his superior, that he was not willing to take any instructions. But we don't talk about those kind of things because we don't want to offend. We don't want to be branded as racists or anything like that. So that's sort of a thing that goes, and I'm just mentioning the examples where I was privy to. I'm not generalizing and say it happens right through, but we don't really always deal on head on rather with the cultural dimensions that also come to play. And so that is the one thing. And I want to latch on to what Loretta said. I think one of the greatest contributions that we can make is sometimes or oftentimes we do separate things. So different universities would be collecting data about their university and what they can do with their communities that they engage with and their stakeholders. But we don't always get together and say, look, can't we look at what we already know and how do we then do a much bigger initiative than an individual university or university with its own partners, but in a greater thing. Loretta, I was just thinking, maybe we haven't discussed it. Maybe we should be doing this at our Cape Bioeducation Consortium. We're both on the board, on the Czech board, at that level, really engaging with the issues of GBV and the role that universities in the Western Cape can play before we just do our own individual things. And because when it comes to such a big societal issue, and I also want to agree, we are just really a microcosm of society. And because it's such a big societal issue, it's not something that an individual university can tackle on its own. And it's not something where there's place for competitiveness or any of those other kind of things where we want to be ahead. But where universities can actually take hands and say, okay, how do we then pull our capabilities? Because we might have different capabilities, similar to how you would like to solve a water issue. You can solve or attempt at least to make some contribution within your given area and within your space of influence. So I think that maybe it's time for bigger initiatives than the silos that we sometimes have, and then taking it beyond the talk shops and the webinars into real action that can be lived and seen in the society where we all come from.
Thank you very much. Professor Ferris, you wanted to say something before? Your hand is up again.
Yeah, I wanted to come in on this point around cultural norms. And, in our constitution, the South African Constitution, of course, we have different rights. There is the right to respect culture, but the fundamental principles of our constitution speaks to equality and freedom, right? And so for me, we don't say there's a hierarchy of rights, but we do know that these are the values that we really value. And so I think it's okay for us as a university to say that for us, equality and gender equality in our workplace is much more important, or as a university is much more important than relying on individual ideas of what is culture. And I say individual ideas of what is culture because there's this notion that culture is static, that culture doesn't evolve, and so therefore, there's always this kind of bumping up of patriarchy and gender-based violence because apparently we need to respect culture and culture is not something that can change. And I have an issue with that, right? And so, I've a couple of years ago, I was on a disciplinary panel where issue was sexual harassment. And the defense was raised that actually it's part of my culture to behave in certain ways. And we simply said, sorry, but we have a policy that outlaws your behavior at this university. And so we found this person guilty. So I think it's about putting your mouth, It's about doing, like Vivian said, and sometimes it's very difficult, sometimes it's political, but you sometimes just need to demonstrate the action. Okay,
thank you. We're going to have another session right at the end, but before we go there, just something for you to think about. You don't have to respond to it now. It's the issue of it's a question. Do you consider levels of gender-based violence each successive year as KPIs for university performance? In other words, do you say last year this was the percentage, this is the percentage, and Professor Ferris mentioned the issue of data, the importance of data, which is absolutely important, no doubt about it. How do you categorize the causes? In other words, someone could have acted out of anger, maybe because that particular individual maybe has a short temper. They couldn't be, it doesn't have anything to do with the way they were grown. I'm just saying, all right. So do you say most causes are based on anger, spontaneity, or some of them could be cultural? This person really believes that to discipline a woman, you must slap her. Or, I mean, we know that violence in South Africa towards women, it goes beyond slapping. I'm not underestimating all of that, all right? But I think it'd be interesting to see what is at the root of the behavior of each individual, and to what extent do these causes cut across, and what can we do then? What remedial measures can we put in place to make sure that over time there is a progressive reduction of these things? But let's think about these things, and we'll have a fuller discussion at the end. I would like to call, before she feels that I'm being unfair towards her, Professor from the Anne Ryan. Are you here, Anne?
I'm here.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks, guys. It's been really interesting. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello to all of you, and thank you for inviting me again. I really love these web seminars, and already I've learned a lot. So I also would add international cooperation on these issues. I will ask 3 questions. The first is, what responsibilities do universities have? Next, can we trust universities? And third, what should universities do? So before I start, I'll just make a few comments on gender equality and gender-based violence, with GE much wider than the other. And it does include, as some of you said, both attitudes and activities, but it also relates to morality and freedom that you, Loretta, pointed to. And I'll come back to that. But when it comes to gender-based violence, the puzzle is that it challenges social order, but yet it's delicate. It's everywhere, yet it thrives in dark corners. It's reported but ignored. It crosses cultural, class, all kinds of boundaries, yet resistant to change. And what I'm saying might also be reflecting Norway more than other places. This we can talk about later. So it means the two phenomena are related, but yet they are distinct. So now let me proceed to my questions. The first is, what responsibilities do universities have? And the classic way of looking upon us is that we should provide knowledge, and we do. The more controversial is, should we also work for social justice and equality? Norwegian politicians do consult and they do commission research that they use to carve out politics and their different positions. Though it depends how they work. It depends on the complexity of the issues. If we go to philosophy, we could ask a question, what do we mean by equality? And the light version would be to say, well, is it about equal opportunities, for example, to a life with gender equality, or does it deal with equal results? Because then the focus will be on access to help, to heal and restore. So I understand that both of our universities, we have decided to tear down the fences or the boundaries around our campuses to connect with a wider society. So that's great. So that's a very good point of departure. I just want to point to, when it comes to research, that if we want to do participatory community research, that does not always comply with the classic principles of research, especially the more radical versions of it. So there might also be things to sort out here. Okay, the next is, can we trust universities? And you have now reported a lot of instances. Let me just give you a few examples from Norway inside universities. Like one where a male supervisor had an affair with his PhD student. she left because after it was over, she was left with the same supervisor. His friend also had an affair with his PhD student, but she left to another country and finalized it. Both instances were reported, but they were ignored. Another one, an elderly professor, he too had sexual harassed his PhD student, both at campus and at the conference. All the colleagues knew, but there were no reactions because they said, we all know what he's like. So, reported, but no formal reactions. In another story, a visiting professor proclaimed to young female staff during a department dinner that he would like to go to bed with her. She reported that to her head of department, who said, "It's so disgusting," and just saw it as her private problem and did nothing. So she and her female colleagues made a document for one of the department meetings to put it on the agenda and made sure that the visiting professor's contract was not reviewed. But it was held against them. And at a party camp off campus, a drunken male employee pulled down his trousers in front of a student, and he was degraded from a higher administrative position into a lecturer for young students. Peculiar. My point with these stories is to say that these are instances that show the institutional responses very often are absent, they are slow, or they are problematic. So it means that, as some of you have pointed to, that universities are just like any other organization. They are made up of networks, social networks, with trust and loyalty, and a friend does not report another friend. And if you report, it's bad for your career, and you can win, but still you lose. Also, I think new public management, as the organizational model that we go by, provides a lot of hurdles in this field. So when we go from policy to practice, as a paradox, courses at universities can feed on their own examples. And this helps us to understand, and this is vital, the intricate of appearance, a social order, and that some do not want change. We have to deal with that too. So simply that when we go from theories to practice, it gets foggy. Now, my last question, what should universities do? And then I will briefly point to what, who, and how. There's only place for a few comments here. The classic usually is courses and studies. But the question is, maybe these perspectives should in all courses, because now I've showed the problem in organizational theories. It's very relevant. Or in philosophy, if we discuss equality or freedom, in pedagogics or in health. And also different, as you pointed to, Sally, different masculinities, the whole spectrum of this. But also it would be important to link it up with GE and GBV in wars, in extremist organizations, in tourism, and in arts. For example, in rap, but also prose and other kinds of poems and other kinds of literature. So, as you said, life outside permeates life inside. And in the organizational practices, things tend to get normalized and then invisible. Who should we work with? We agree, when it comes to, we need to use our academic staff. And I think we should cast the net very wide. It deals with law, economy, for example, societal costs, social works on family and children, literature on textual representations and what they do, studies in communications to analyze media in ICT and the online world and dark networks, sociology and social anthropology on theoretical critical studies and field work. Someone doing studies at campuses. But also, it is so pertinent, as you showed from your university campus, to work with people in practice, like the police or the bureaucrats, because when I talked about femicide earlier, one problem in Norway, we have a fantastic bureaucracy, but it's so sectioned, so they never link the different warnings they get. It's regarded as separate warnings. Youth clubs, teachers, dentists, they see a lot. Shelters, mosques and churches or other congregations. Okay, so it is the academic side of it, but it's also the practical side of it. And I'm really impressed by, Loretta, what you told us about, what you do. And the last thing I will address is how. I think also it might be very good to make different kinds of courses, but I would suggest they should be elective and open. Some could be digital, and with a minimum fee or no fee at all. So last time I organized a course that was open for the public, I got it was an integration, and I got a lot of fantastic telephones, but they wanted to tell me they wanted to join in, but they couldn't because of the price, and I hadn't checked the price. It was more than $2,000 to participate. So we see how that's a huge hurdle. So it's also a monetary question, at least in Norway. So I definitely think that universities can do things to get G and GBV out of the closets. So I will just end up right now by saying, let's start up. Make universities change makers.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. It's very, very, some of it is depressing, I have to say, but we'll discuss it after this. It's in South Africa, it's 4 o'clock, it's 3 o'clock in Norway, I believe. So we have a lot of time to have one more presentation by Nina Mdwaba. I think she's based in the UK. Nina, it's your turn to tell us a story.
Hello.
Hello, Nina.
Hi, sorry, I have a beeping noise happening in the background, so I hope that doesn't annoy anybody too much. Maybe it's annoying me, so I just thought I should name that.
We can't hear it. Yeah.
Well, I'm actually based at the moment in South Africa because I'm South African. Okay. But I study in the UK, so I'm actually also training to be a therapist, which I think kind of you'll hear when I start speaking, I guess, why that's maybe important, because a lot of the things that I'm speaking about are based in psychological theory. But I wanted to share a poem first, because I'm also a spoken word artist, so I thought I'd start there. So I have a piece called Cages Have Keys. Hi from my heart to yours. If you had a conversation with her, she'd tell you that she prefers to lock her cage and reinforce them in chain. A man comes knocking and shares they knows a thing or two about cages and that chains have keys all the same. Well, my heart has been pleading for 2 decades and 4 years to please unlock her, please. But see, my heart has been deceived. She doesn't quite understand this construction called love. She has no idea about the real world where intimacy among men is fueled by porn industries and deadbeat daddies who never taught their kids how to say please before taking from a woman. And I'm betting that they never learned the word no when discussing the birds and the bees in safe settings, never learned that hearts in cages are about letting one in. Not about consent or why things of a sexual nature left unnurtured by healthy models quickly turn into weeds. No, see, a passage needs to be forged before crossing these boundaries. No one told him that sometimes intimacy can be like trees, and if you hack at the roots long enough, you'll expose them to disease. She'll start to believe that she has nothing else to give because she's rotted to the core, nothing to give anymore. Doesn't have the strength to believe in love for sure. No nutrients left for the next leech or for vermin men who present themselves as butterflies in these streets. Yes, so many precious bodies lay battered in these sheets. So we live in fear of the next man who offers himself with bright colored wings knocking at our door. no, see, these hearts have seen flowers and empty promises before, so excuse me if I think it's better to throw away the key. Keep myself untarnished from thee. Handing out keys was so much easier when I was younger. But the world and men have been unkind, so I vowed to lock her up a little longer. So that poem is called Cages. Cages Have Keys. And I've been picking up so much from all the distinguished speakers that I've been making so many notes. So I have a lot to share. I hope I have the time to share it.
Are you going to share your poem on the platform?
I can do that. I can.
That'll be good. Okay.
So I guess what I wanted to talk about is a number of things, and I think beginning is sex education. I think when I think of my years in school, which was maybe 10, 15 years ago, I always think about how sex education was spoken about in a way that was so kind of logistical and physical, and there was a lot about kind of the health, I think, aspects of, talking about HIV and protection. I think that's all very necessary. But I think something that's been left out of that conversation, at least for me, is the psychological impact of that intimacy, the psychological impact of love and intimacy. Thinking back on conversations that we had where consent was never a discussion point. And I think that in university, I mean, I'm still in university, but I'm thinking about my undergrad years because I'm now doing a master's. I keep thinking about the times where in my own kind of organizations I was working in, I was part of the feminist organization, and consent was something that we spoke about so much in terms of how we were even just speaking with other people and how much we were trying to keep our boundaries amongst each other respected. But it seems that intimacy, especially from interactions between, I guess, men and women, is something that consent never gets considered. And I've always wondered why that was never the core of the conversation, because I think it also creates a parallel with when you look at gender-based violence, actually, and you look at how we even consider gender-based violence. I think a lot of it still centers around this physical action of perpetrating rather than the psychological impact that leaves scars as well. And I think consent as well forms a big part of that conversation of does someone enter into this relationship with you, or have you forced them into this relationship with you? I think for university and like the years of high school, these are formative years when we're learning about what love is, I think, as young women. And if these lessons are not being kind of integrated into our education system, then the foundation is essentially missing, I think. So I think it's important when looking at universities. I was thinking about my first week in university, for instance, in undergrad. We went to parties and we met different people. There was a big kind of social aspect to that. But again, why were conversations about sex and consent not being had in those early weeks? And I wonder if, in these kind of orientation weeks and these what we call Freshers Week, if that's something that could be implemented. I think as well, it would be necessary to have kind of courses in the university that are compulsory within that first week to take, whether these are based on online platforms, as the other distinguished speakers have mentioned, or having workshops as well, where people can kind of enter into that space, knowing it's a safe space where questions can be asked and discussions can be had with men and women in the same space. I think these conversations obviously and often get separated. I think women have these conversations with other women, and I wonder, because I guess I'm not a man, how many men are having these conversations without women, and then how does that then get brought together as a community to have these discussions together? I think it's really important that gets highlighted, because you can only really have one perspective, I think, if you're only dealing with, I guess, separate genders or separate sexes or sexualities. I think it's really important to have all these conversations together as a community. I think what else I was talking about. I was also thinking about how, and going back to what I was saying about sex education, about kind of how a lot of intimacy, I think, amongst men especially, is taught from porn. And I'm not anti-porn in any way. I'm not saying that porn is the issue. I'm just saying that it's something that I think we need to name as educators and as role models for younger children and younger people. I think that knowing that porn perpetuates fantasies of aggression in intimacy can be quite dangerous to a developing brain, can be quite dangerous to the male developing brain as well. And obviously it could go both ways. I'm not saying that women don't also perpetuate these things, but I think that it's important for us to note that these things happen when there's no one to kind of say, okay, what you're seeing is not real. What you're seeing is a fantasy in the way that it's constructed and who gets to construct it. I also think that in terms of the conversation on culture, this is something that I've actually really been struggling with for a very long time. I think that culture is always a sensitivity, and I think it's important that people are always sensitive to culture. But I also think that we also need to question and challenge certain things within our cultures. I don't think that because culture stands, it means that it's always right. I think we need to be able to look at culture and say, okay, this works, but this doesn't work. And and also look at the root of why our cultures do function the way they do. As a Black South African woman, I'm highly, highly aware, almost painfully sometimes aware of how patriarchal our cultures are. And I think that I wonder, I guess this is more of a question, I wonder where that base of patriarchy really comes from, and whether that was always the case, that our indigenous cultures go hand in hand with patriarchy, or if this is something that has been modeled over the years and over time that we now consider, like you were saying, Charlie, you were saying, has become the norm. You know, we see this aggressive behavior and we now believe that, you know, if a woman says something or does something that makes her husband unhappy, then he smacks her. But where does that come from? And I also think what's really interesting, and I look a lot kind of post-colonial theory when thinking about my own work, because I'm planning to work in trauma-based racial work. And I think post-colonial theory is really important, because I think it also shows us that there's a lot of things that we've also adopted from a Western mentality. That's not to say that abuse is Western, but I wonder how much of our own cultures have also been integrated into this kind of Western notion of patriarchy, firstly, but also when we think about this, our history as South Africans, when we look at apartheid, after apartheid, there was a lot of poverty. There still is a lot of poverty. There's a lot of anger, and what that perpetuates is violence, and violence really just perpetuates more trauma. So I think we're constantly traumatizing each other as well in the society as a result of becoming, alcoholics because of poverty, and then being abusive and being domestically abusive. So I think there's a lot to think about, because I think they're also intertwined, and some of them are quite intrinsically intertwined. I think when you look at intimacy and abuse and love, and how those in our brains, how those relationships start to become intertwined, like you were saying, you know, someone says he slaps me because he loves me. I think those notions of love also get confused over time when that's all you're seeing. So we need healthy models of love, essentially, to be able to challenge those notions of he slaps me because he loves me. And I think universities are at the best place in a young person's development to challenge that, because if all we have, like I was saying, what I feel is missing from school years is the kind of physical aspect and the biological aspect of what sex is. What we really need to learn is the emotional aspect of what intimacy is. And I'm not only talking about sex, of course, I'm talking about relationships and love. I think they all really need to be almost picked apart in a way, and shown that you can have love without fear and pain, and you can have an open, honest, consensual relationship with the partner. It doesn't need to be forced. And if you are struggling for whatever reason, because we all come from some kind of trauma in our lives, everyone has some trauma in our lives. If you're coming from some kind of trauma in your life, I think it's also important that our universities then also look to having facilities like how I think it was Professor Ferris was saying at UCT, what they're doing is amazing. They have these strategic relationships with clinics and counselors and therapists. There needs to be a place where everyone feels safe to go, men and women feel safe to go and say, I need help, essentially. I'm being violent or I'm being abused. I think there's trauma on both sides, and that's not in any way to excuse or protect perpetrators. But I think it's important for us to also understand that if the base of our society is dealing with so much trauma all the time, there is no way that we can expect it to all magically just kind of disappear once people get to university, because that is almost 18, 19 years of behavior that has almost been concretized and kind of developed to become someone's personality in some ways, what ends up happening over time. I was also thinking about community leaders. I think one of the distinguished speakers spoke about churches and mosques, and I think this also kind of speaks to what we were talking about culture. Is we need community leaders who are able to speak to young men as much as young men with other young men at university are speaking with each other. I think it's important to have male cultural and community leaders who are also speaking against gender-based violence and educating about gender-based violence in all kinds of different settings. I think the conversation really just needs to be had on a societal level, but definitely, unfortunately, the impact of patriarchy is also that men listen mainly to men. So I think it's really important that there are male models, older male models, who are there to say, this is not okay, and here's why it's not okay, and here's how we can all together work together as men to fight against this. I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. That is really, really powerful. I would like us to get into another session of question and answer. I want to go to Norway first before I come to South Africa. Professor Whitaker, I think, mentioned earlier that at least 50% of university students in Norway are female students. Does it make any difference in your view? Does it, the fact that there are more women than males or equal numbers, does it make it easier, or does it I mean, what difference does it make in terms of GBV? Do you think it's a factor that makes GBV less strong than it would be in South Africa? That's one question. And Professor Ryan, you also mentioned the issue of the culture. I think a lot of what you said has to do with the culture at universities. Surely, if there are clear values and regulations that are communicated to everybody, for instance, that I know that at UCT, it's clear you can't have a sexual relationship with your student, full stop, right? So if the regulation is clear, surely then it should be easier than to come out of the networks, as it were. It's written, you can't have a relationship, and you've had a relationship, therefore there's got to be sanction, there's got to be consequence. If there's no consequence, then the thing continues, right? So what is the problem in Norway?
Yeah.
May I respond to you?
Yeah.
Soneva?
Well, go ahead. Yeah, I have a few comments on that, but go ahead, Anna.
Okay, thank you. That's why I want to say that even if you have a law, you have a regulation, you also have ordinary life.
Right.
And they don't always go together, because in Norway, there is no way a man can say a woman should obey her husband.
Right.
If you say that would be regarded illegitimate, unless you belong to a very conservative Christian congregation, or maybe to an immigrant diaspora, or you say that behind closed doors. But you cannot say that openly.
Right.
So in one way, we come a long way, compared to 40 years ago. But we still have steps to go. And that's where you come into the big issue of power. Because when you're in a university, people aspire to make careers. And even though we all think it should be gender equal, we know there's a history. You don't have to say much, but you can say You mention a word, you can tell a story, and everybody knows. And this is powerful, how you can kind of regulate a female colleague having to do with rank in the staff, for example, and how men can rank up in their network and make it illegitimate to report someone who has done something that shouldn't be done. And
don't you have a problem in Norway of women enabling that? Women who conspire with men who accept that this is what it is. I mean, guys accept it. Or, we've always had stories of women acting against, giving legitimacy to that kind of conduct and protecting it. Sometimes the person you have to report to could be a woman, but that woman might be mindful of a job, perhaps, or might be saying, but what's the big deal? Just move on. Don't you have that problem in Norway?
You're so right. We have all the different kinds of problems. But of course, I just want to say, as you said before, we still draw the old heritage with us that men are, regarded to be those in positions. Right. Despite having, female leaders, there's a lot of invisible activities, interactions going on that are tricky. Can I also say something when I'm here about the varieties? Because in many ways, to work at a university is like heaven on earth, also in Norway in many ways. It's a good place to be. At the same time, for example, you can come to Norway as a foreigner and stay for 3 months. Right. If you're longer, you have to apply. So there are some men who find it bothersome to have women like us. They'd rather have more timid women. Oh. So what they do, now I kind of generalize, they import women from Asia. The women hope they would be the chosen for a marriage. Right. And accept being harassed and bullied for 3 months. They end up in the shelters for battered women. The persons working there say it is the same men, the women staying with the same men over and over again. Why can't we stop these men from importing these women? They don't come anyway. So you see the big variety also, that's what I wanted to say. Right. And that's some of the complexities of it. I also want to say on research, because we need much more research on this, and what we also need to do is to go into, explore into what categories and what categories do, to explore into concepts and the limits of concepts and how these work in these different groups. Because we cannot just say, this is the correct version. We need to know, we need to explore into that. That's we need so much more knowledge. And there was a European program on this issue where I participated with 29 European countries, and we had 145 million euros for this. But not one single euro for research. It was for networking. Oh. So I definitely think we should start up something. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Professor Whittaker.
Yes, well, yeah, really interesting the things that Anna brought up as well, because at a previous webinar, a SANA webinar, I mentioned the fact that, you have this saying in Africa about when you educate a woman, you educate a whole community, whereas in Norway, if you educate a woman, she leaves the community. And that's, in fact, something that we see in rural areas where the girls leave to get an education, and then they move on and live in the big towns, whereas you have some men who remain there, and they try to recruit wives from Thailand, from Russia, from other parts of the world. And there is a lot of I think there is a lot of gender violence in those areas, because often these women are highly educated and there's really a mismatch. It's just a type of arrangement. There's no love involved. And many of these women think, okay, if I just stay in this relationship for, I think it's 2 years, then I can actually get, a work permit and then I can leave. But, I'll just have to hang in there and support this for, just accept this situation. But moving on to something else that Anna said as well, about this, relationships between PhD students and professors, let's say. I think it was Henry Kissinger who said that power is the greatest aphrodisiac, right? And a lot of PhD students really admire their professors. And in some cases, this turns into be, a real true relationship. I know lots of married couples who started out, in these types of supervisor student relationships, and then they've happily married and have kids and whatnot. But I think being aware of this, it's a bit like psychologists and transference. I think there's a lot of things going on there, lots of different mechanisms. But you asked the question about whether the fact that there's actually a slight majority of girls among our students. I think, the one thing is what I mentioned about the boys staying back in the rural areas and the girls moving to town. But there's another aspect, and that is that there is gender imbalance between different types of study programs. And one that's really relevant is psychology, where about 90% of the students are girls, because you need really good grades to get into that type of study program. And the girls just do better and they're interested in those areas. And I think that's a problem when we're thinking about men and the ability to speak about their psychological problems and issues. There has been talk about actually having a quota for men to... to remedy that imbalance among students, because down the line, you'll have men who want to speak to a male psychologist and there won't be any men available. We see the same thing within medicine, that there is a majority of girls taking those types of studies. But another aspect is that, in leadership positions at the university, there is gender balance. For instance, at our university, there's a practically 50% balance at all levels, from the university leaderships to the deans to the heads of department. But there is getting more, let's say, associate professors to become professors and so on. That's where we're struggling. Because that's a period of life where you have children. And even though, we do talk about gender equality, it is true that, that women often take more responsibility for what's going on in the homes. So that's a major issue within the universities, is getting female faculty members to qualify to become full professors. And
thank you very much.
Just one last thing, because we were talking about how we can raise awareness among children about these matters. And I was just thinking about a nice project that we probably could do in collaboration. We have a group of faculty members and students working in the teacher training program, and they have come up with this sort of technological device, VR, using virtual reality. To be used out in schools, where the pupils are given sort of ethical choice situations, and they have to choose between different ways of solving the problems. And this is apparently works quite well. So it's sort of a role play, but using technology as well. And they've done it to address issues of bullying, but I'm sure that this could be sort of adopted to be used specifically when it comes to gender violence.
That's interesting. Very interesting. So, okay, let's move to South Africa a little bit. I know, again, in South Africa, you can't talk about South Africa or to South Africa without mentioning race. Now, I want to put together the issue of cultural practices that are ingrained, and even Nina referred to them earlier, where she grew up, and patriarchy, all that stuff. Now, if you were, and the question I want to ask, but I'm starting at the back end of it. The question I want to ask is, what role can universities play to raise the consciousness, to get communities to understand that, we have to move on from certain things at least. But if we have from a university that said, yeah, it's important, let's play that role, say UCT or University of Western Cape. But if you have a white professor or a white leader saying those things, especially speaking at Black culture or African culture, it's automatically going to be pushed back as racist, as who are you, monopoly or colonialist, coming here to tell us how to live, da-da-da-da-da. You can't tell that. So it legitimizes the speaker on the basis of the racial identity. It makes it really hard to have that conversation. I mean, in South Africa, it's very hard to have conversations on issues that do matter when you're white, because immediately they throw the race card at you. It legitimizes you. You can't say that because you're white, because of apartheid, because of colonialism. Now, how do universities in South Africa, Professor Loretta and Lawak, get leaders who are Black? And, look, my ideal world is one where it doesn't matter. But if you want to have that engagement, you need Black leaders at universities to say, guys, I'm Black like you, but we have to have this conversation. It cannot be right that we do these things. And I mean, it can be students as well. Students and leaders, basically Black men or Black women have to play their part, because then they can't be legitimized, illegitimized, or delegitimized on the basis of how they look, because they really make it hard. I mean, of course, you might get somebody who will say, yeah, you're too colonial, or you're too, one of our leaders, one of our past presidents, Mbeki, was referred to as a Black African, as a Black British, So he was Black outside, but he was not really Black, because he had lost all the mannerisms and the cultural allegiances, as it were. So you do have those things that people get thrown into in South Africa. How can universities play a role so that they don't just end up just dealing with the manifestation of GBV, but they try to play a role at where it starts? And I'm not saying, I'm going to be careful here. I'm not suggesting that all GBV is practiced by Black students. I'm not saying that. It can come anywhere. But you still need to identify all those sources and address them without being delegitimized on the basis of your skin color. Does it make sense? Professor Loretta Paris and...
Previously, I talked about the fact that we take an intersectional approach to issues of gender-based violence. So we don't talk about gender without also talking about race, also talking about privilege, and also talking about class. Right. So I think that's a very first important point to make, is that we need to acknowledge that all of these things that you've just mentioned exist. And then we need to be able to have very strong, honest, and direct conversations about it, because we cannot allow, for example, conversations about the race to derail the real issue around gender-based violence. Right. But really, to be honest, Solly, I mean, I don't necessarily see that playing out very strongly at UCT. But I hear you saying, well, what are you doing as a university? And so I think it is important to have conversations, to debunk myths, to speak very clearly about, culture versus, and I think Nina made that point as well, about what is culture really, and to what extent is culture something that evolves or not. I often say that, perhaps it's time that cultural practices catch up with the Constitution and the constitutional values, because ultimately our constitutional values overrides discriminatory cultural practices. And I think that's a very important conversation to have as well. I think what is important is also who speaks. And it's important that Black leaders speak up. I think it's probably more important that they do that in government, because I think that's a conversation that's really absent by our leaders, right? I think I have a black female vice chancellor who takes a very strong stance against gender-based violence. So she's certainly at my university taking on that role. But we need to see that. Need to see that role being taken at a national level as well. At some point, Solly, I do want to just make some comments around the issues of consent that Nina raised and the issues that Anne raised about what do universities do. I think there's some interesting, but I'll park it for now.
Okay, we should talk about that. Nina, don't worry, that was my next. But any other comments, Professor Lowe, you wanted to say something?
Maybe just to say that I was also going to mention the intersectionality, but I also think that context is quite important. So, for example, UWC's context is so different from UCT that it might, those kind of conversations that Loretta mentioned might not find its way at UCT, where it might find its way in a totally different way because of the fact that we're a former historically disadvantaged institution, and we draw our students mostly from disadvantaged areas, and most of our students happen to be Black students. So, but one of the issues, and we didn't really speak as much about it, is also the intersectionality between not just race and class and privilege, etc., but also about Black women being lesbian, and how we don't talk about corrective rape as much as we talk about other forms of GBV. Right. And especially if you are a Black woman, even in higher education, I've seen that played out in some law faculties in our country where it's a Black woman and she happens to be lesbian and she's in a leadership position, and how some of the colleagues then, whether at a higher level or whether in that faculty, actually react to that reality of the women leader. And so there are so many things that, depending on, it was interesting when you mentioned, Savina, that you have about 50-50. I think we've got 60%, at least more than 60% women or female students at our university, and it might be similar at UCT as well. So, and those are also what we've noticed in our graduation ceremonies, higher performing than a lot of male students. And we're getting worried about, in a sense, the boy child. What is happening and why are they not performing as well as the women students? So it's in a sense sometimes even more complex than saying it's only the culture, or all these things are so intertwined that it becomes quite difficult if your context is different. And so I thought I must just bring that into the pot. And I like Nina's idea. Maybe there is a way in which when our education faculties also conceptualize their own curricula, that when it starts at our universities in the education curricula, it then feeds into what happens at schools. As an additional way of also influencing. I mean, we have subjects such as life orientation, where sex education would be part of life orientation. But if it is, like Nina's saying, mostly focused on the mechanics or, the physical side and not as much on the emotional side, then it's well worth looking into and see how, through new teachers coming to the system from a new generation, we also influence what happens and that is apart from our relationship with the government departments that deal with educational or basic education curricula. So I thought I'll maybe just put that in the as my perspective as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Nina, the concept of consent. Look, I think we must all accept that students at university will have sex at some point, or at least some of them. And some of it is consensual, and you can't control that unless you put cameras all over the place to make it entirely impossible. But what you don't want to see happen is that leading to violence. Maybe one of the partners, this could be the lady saying, you know what, I'm not interested anymore, thank you, goodbye. So I used to be a university student, as you can tell, and I grew up in Soweto, right? When I go to my first degree was done in Wits, and then I moved to France. But both in France and in South Africa, I had boys like to hunt for girls, and some girls like to play the game. And I think it'll always happen. The question is, how do you make sure that it happens in a safe way? So what are we talking about? Are we saying there should not be what is consent, and consent to what? But also, how do you stop the consent? Because maybe consent it could be contractual, right? It is a life. It could be at some point. I think a lot of boys struggle with, you know what? Thank you, I've had enough. I need to move on, and that's when it becomes a problem. A lot of times when there's GBV, whether on or off campus, is when the woman says, "I don't want anymore," and the man says, "No, you're not going anywhere." So how do we? Of course, there's got to be the punitive aspect. There's got to be outcomes, results for people who behave, in the way that we're describing. But we also have to create a culture where it's frowned upon. To hit a woman is frowned upon. That's what we should work on. That's the proactive side of things. And I'm not sure that we're doing that enough. That any man who does that must be looked up, down by other men. We hear it happens in prisons. If you go to prison and the year that you are in there because you hit a woman, then they'll come down on you, right? But to what extent are universities playing a role, Nina, that makes it really politically incorrect for boys to not be able to accept that at some point she must say, you know what, thank you, it was great, even if it's 2 months, 3 weeks, one night, no more, goodbye, and then she must accept.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very interesting what you speak about, because I think for me, the conversation around consent really does come back to the understanding of consent, and I think that's something that's been highlighted. I think that in universities, the same way that in a school system we weren't really taught what consent is, I think a lot of people are learning now with the development of social media and the development of kind of speaking out, the Me Too movement, as an example of that, speaking out of, a lot of people are learning for the first time that actually I didn't know that this was rape. I think it also there's an education around that now that's starting to, I think, bubble a little bit more. And it takes me back to this show that I watched recently, and I remember there was a big uproar about it on social media. It's called "I Will Destroy You" by Michaela Cole, and it's I guess in a way it's autobiographical, but there's some fiction in it, and she shows the different scenarios throughout this program. It's quite an intense program, but she shows the different scenarios in which consent has been violated. So I think. And it works both ways. Again, I don't think that consent is only for females to enforce. I think it's for men to also enforce, because I think what you were saying, naturally I've had conversations with my brothers where they're like, I'll be in bed and there'll be a girl who's pushing me a little bit too hard. And I'm like, hey, I don't want to. Whether or not you're in a relationship, there should always be a clear conversation. And I think an honest conversation about the understanding that when someone says no, whether or not they're in a relationship with you, they are married to you, if they are not in the mood, that is a slippery slope to rape culture. I think it's not necessarily that everything equals gender-based violence, but rather that there are steps that are almost kind of simmering too close to it, because people don't understand what the notion of consent. And I think it's important that consent is something that people get educated about. And I think at universities, as I was speaking earlier, as being this kind of extension of the foundation of education we get, speaking about life orientation at UWC, for instance, these are places where I think conversations about consent should really be taken seriously, because it is so murky area. I think that's what people really struggle with. I think there's a lot of girls who have been raped themselves who don't even know that was rape because, I don't know, someone took off a condom, for instance, whilst they were having sex. That is rape. Someone kind of tried to coerce them. That is rape. Someone, bought them too many drinks, but it seemed like they were just having fun. That is rape. The things that I think we don't necessarily speak about because they seem so gray area, are the things that really need to be researched and spoken about in university and education settings. So I don't think I could say necessarily at this point, because I don't know if it's actually been implemented widely enough globally, and especially in South Africa, for me to say for sure that, you know, this would be the thing that helps people get to the point of understanding consent. I just think there needs to be a foundation of education that begins that conversation on what consent is, and when someone says no, what that looks like, and the different ways that someone can say no without even physically saying it. You know, body language is important as well to consider in any situations. If someone looks uncomfortable, it needs to be understood that that person does not want to engage in anything sexual with you. It's also about understanding boundaries. I think there was a conversation earlier about boundaries, understanding that, you know, as people, we have our personal boundaries, and by enforcing those boundaries, they might look different, but boundaries and consent for me they go hand in hand, essentially. So I think it's really about understanding, firstly, what consent means, what consent looks like, how consent can look in different scenarios, what it looks like when someone is pushing that boundary of consent, and when someone is not engaged then in a consensual sexual relationship or intimate relationship with somebody. I don't know if that answered the question.
It makes a lot of sense. I think this is a discussion this particular discussion has to be explored further. And then the idea of the point about there needing to be consensus about what no means, because more and because fortunately I'm a man, I'm heterosexual. Men, you do hear men say, but sometimes she says no, but is that kind of no that says not now, but you know what I'm saying? So what is no? What is no? Stop it.
No is any indication that the person said no. Whether they said no and then gave you a cheeky smile, it's no.
That's not just rhetorical. Don't worry. So I'm saying we do need to have that conversation. No is no, of course, I agree with you. But everybody here on the panel wants to say something. I'm so sorry. Loretta, let's start with you. Nina, Vivian, Anne. I'm sorry, now I'm calling you by your first names. I'm really sorry. But if you want to come and say what you want to say, please. Professor Ferris.
Thanks, Solly. I think this is really a vital conversation. Because I see it playing out. I head up a lot of disciplinary cases or investigation panels into sexual harassment and sometimes into rape. And this is something that comes up time and time again, you know, this notion of consent. And so consent is often used as a defense by the respondent. And it's often an issue that is highly contested. And this is exactly why, you know, I've pushed so hard for the specialized tribunal on gender-based violence, because I wanted a panel of people that are knowledgeable, that understand things such as consent, that understand, as Nina said, when that no is no, and sometimes when that yes is also no. Or can understand and see when somebody has been groomed to say yes, you know, or understand the power relationships that Anne has mentioned in the relationship between a supervisor and a student. Because how do you say no to your supervisor, right? How do you say no? This is somebody that you respect. This is somebody that has power over you. This is the person that's going to determine whether you're successful in your PhD or not. How do you say no? You don't say no. You say yes, but actually you say no, right? Yeah. And so we must not undermine how important it is to have conversations, training, dialogues around consent. And we do that. We have these conversations, and we have conversations also with women, because women, we are not always empowered to say no. We are not always able, and we take on so much guilt. I mean, it's really hard and fascinating, but mostly hard to see in cases where women are saying, I didn't come forward because I felt guilty for not saying no, or not saying no, you know, hard enough, or not saying no in the first instance where that person did something that was inappropriate, or for not saying no when I had sex when actually I didn't want to have sex, right? So, and so Nina has always also talked about the importance of counseling, and that's why we absolutely provide counseling and psychological service, because there's deep trauma that is linked to consent. So yeah, I think it's a very important conversation.
Thank you very much. Professor Whitaker, you want to say something to that? You please unmute yourself.
Yes, here I am. Yeah, and I just wanted to say that, an additional problem is that type of behavior is condoned in popular culture, in films, in music. We have Baby It's Cold Outside. That song was heavily criticized, during the Me Too, trying to coerce someone into staying instead of going home. Sting, I'll Be Watching You, that's a typical stalker. But, these are songs that everyone sings and doesn't really think about. Your lips say no, but your eyes say yes. That is sort of exactly what we're talking about here. And I think, having a critical look at popular culture and what type of values that are sort of conveyed through films, through music is an important aspect of this.
Right. Okay. Professor Ryan?
Sorry?
Did you want to say something? Your hand is up.
Yeah, I did. I was just, I wonder if Viviane wanted to go before me?
Sorry?
I wonder if Viviane tried to say things.
Is actually partially covered. Yeah.
Okay.
My point is actually partially covered by Loretta's point. And I've always been of the belief that one must earn the side of caution when the word no is used. That you would rather infer that it's a real no and not a maybe, or a yes that looks like that's expressed as a no. And it's also, in a sense, as a society, and this is something where we as universities can also play a role in terms of our awareness making in societies, that we teach our boy children also that a no, doesn't matter how it's expressed, is a no. And we've got an interesting situation in South Africa also, that so many of our women don't know that you can actually even say no when you're married, and that we've got a marital rape as a recognized offense and a sexual offense. And if you say no, even though not even just in a relationship, but even though you're married and you've said no, your no should be your no. And I think that kind of it came across as quite a theme about, beyond awareness raising, having these courageous conversations about consent, not just on campuses, but also in our communities, because I'm not always sure how many of our women in the communities even know that they are allowed to say no to their husbands, in our law anyway. And so this is something that I think maybe we can take further at some of our other talks. So how do we make sure that there's a sort of a shared understanding of consent and a shared understanding of what a no means, that a no doesn't necessarily mean a yes, but I'm just saying no. Okay. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, and maybe.
Okay. You want to go for it? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think this is so interesting, and I want to connect with something that Nina said, because you talked about different kinds of, or a lot of words, which I would refer to as concepts. So let me just repeat some of them. Sex, violence, rape, consent. And that's what I mean, where we have to explore into these concepts. What do we mean by them? And what do they mean to people, and how do they employ them? And as you, Viviane, you referred to context. And I wonder, how do people use them in different contexts? Do they change? For example, in my fieldwork, people said there is no such thing as marital rape. Okay, so you use rape then in a different way compared to let's say, if you have a one-night stand without consent.
Right.
So we need to go. This is, I think, where it's fertile. We use practice. We draw on data, and then we explore into it intellectually, and then we take them with us again to people who work in practice. And I think this is how we can make these fantastic circles. And I also, just briefly, if I may, say something that I ran for many, many years a very, I would say, fun course on understanding cultures. And, this is about making students think in different ways, employ different gazes to the same phenomena. For example, did we discuss money or informal money being paid, like bribes, corruptions, or blatt in Russia? And then we took it back to Norway. Do we have things like that? And they all said no. And then we went into different kinds of, into different political areas, and they suddenly said, Then we used, for example, Patricia Hill Collins on Outsider Within, on black women in US. And then we talked about how that text speaks to some of us and not to other people, because my courses are cultural and ethnicity mixed.
Right.
And then we also talked about bodies and gender. And there we talked about tourism, about war on consumerism and so on. And then the students, we ended up with the students themselves lecturing and speaking to the group. I thought that was a real fun course, and we were just a few from the beginning, but eventually, we were much more than 100 because there were so many who came and took it. And I thought, how great to do this with people from practice. And then engage these people together with our students. So now I go back to what can universities do? Do they have a role to play? And I think that what we've said today, if we could put this into some kind of document and use that and also learn from, I'm just so impressed by what you've done, in University of Cape Town and in Western Cape, and all these, when we hear, because it reflects that we do things differently in different cultures. I think that's also why we don't have as much on these issues at campus that we have, because we think that, young women tend to say in our country that, no, we have gender equality. So it might sometimes be difficult for them to understand, when you start getting a job and you want to have a career, you'll see there's some ceiling. It's maybe not glass, maybe it's of stone. So it's really been fantastic. I've learned a lot, and I think it's a lovely dialogue and very important that I would really love to see if we can make something out of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, ladies, it's now 5 minutes to 5 in South Africa, 5 minutes to 4 in Norway, in Oslo, whatever. And Nina's hand is up. If you want, I would like to maybe give each one of you just 1 minute, not too long, please. Just make your concluding remarks. Nina, you go first, and the others will come, and then I'll speak before we close. Nina, your turn.
Thanks, Solly. I guess I was just trying to also pick up from what Anne was saying. I think definitely it's really important for there to be a working language. There's something in psychology that we speak of as a working language where everyone can access that language. I think it's important that, especially with education systems and higher education, I think there tends to be this elitism around it where certain language is inaccessible to everybody. And I think that's something that is really important, is to have language that is accessible when teaching about consent, to bringing examples, when teaching about rape culture, bringing examples. These are all really important things to make this an accessible thing, I think, for everyone to understand. I guess I just say thank you for having me. And I hope to engage in another one of these conversations. I've learned a lot, and it's been great being amongst this panel.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go? Professor Lawak, you want to just 1 minute to say a few words before we end?
Thank you very much, Solly. Just to say thank you, if there's anything that I'm taking from this, is that there's a window for us to collaborate and to share experiences across different contexts, and that one would be able to collaboration, I think having to have a greater impact than what I said as individual institutions. So I am looking forward to, I know Anne and I have been having lots of conversations in a different setting, but looking forward to see how one can collaborate on these quite important issues, even though we might come at it from our different country contexts as well. And lovely to meet all of you. And Nina, lovely to finally put your a face to your name.
Thank you. Professor Whitaker?
Yes, there you are. Yes, well, I would also like to thank you for this really interesting and stimulating discussion. I think there's a lot to learn, and I think I agree with Nina that discussions around the idea of consent is really essential, and is something that we I think this is a problem that we share, across countries. And I really hope that this conversation can continue in other webinars and in other forms in the future. So thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you. Professor Ferris?
So from my side also, thank you, to the organizers, to you, Solly, for moderating this panel. I think it's actually you made the point that we kind of have a season in which we talk about this, right? When it's a certain month, or it's, in South Africa, it's the month of activism, and then we have the conversation, or something happens that is really rocking us as a society, and then we have the conversation. So thank you for having the conversation out of season, because this is a way to make sure that we keep talking, that we keep these issues alive. And so I've also learned from colleagues. I will blatantly steal some of these ideas that was put on the table, because that's what this is all about. It's about to learn. It's about sharing of ideas, being humble about the always needing to learn more about what to do. And I also look forward to collaborating with everyone here going forward. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies. I just want to say a few things. First of all, to thank the South African Norwegian Society for Association for organizing this very interesting debate. What often frustrates me is that we come together like this, we share these awesome ideas and what needs to happen, what are the problems, but after that there's no report. I really hope that some kind of summary will come out of this thing with recommendations to say these are the key things. Some of them are the global issues, some of them could be country specific, but how do we work together? How do we, I like the idea of the tribunals, for instance, that Professor Ferris mentioned at UCT. To what extent can that be replicated in other universities? So that it's not, each university is not left standing on its own. Of course, some universities have more resources than others. They have more associations, more sponsors, and all that. But how do you make sure that there's a word from the university? It could be, in terms of the relationship between the two countries, Norway and South Africa, maybe SANA could facilitate something that says we spoke. Of course, there are many more South African universities which are not part of this, and we have to be realistic, but it could start somewhere. So these are the key things that came out. How do we take it forward so that when next year the discussion is had, it's not a repeat of what we would have discussed this year? But I also want to throw something into the spanner there, if you allow me, before I go, that, power, I don't know, one of you mentioned the I think it's Professor Whitaker mentioned power and how power is an aphrodisiac. But power is an aphrodisiac even in the hands of women. I have seen powerful women not use GBV, but use their power to lure sex from, even at universities, professors, I can tell you that, okay? To lure sexual favors from, say, PhD students. The same thing that you said about, but, this person has the power for me to pass, for me to, it goes both ways. Of course, the overwhelming percentage of GBV and harassment goes towards women. There's nobody can deny that. But power does corrupt, and power does make people behave in a way that says, you know what, I'm this powerful, I can get this from this person. So I think that it's important to look at the power from that perspective as well. I grew up in Soweto, I said earlier, and there are men, I can tell you this, I know black men in Soweto who abused black boys for sex. Nobody talks about that. Nobody. Okay? And it's like people, I don't know, people don't talk about it. Some of those men I see today on social media. Those men who used to take boys, teenage boys, and go and abuse them, they are there on playing important, respected men in society today. We don't talk about that. And again, I'll go back to this beginning. One of you mentioned that a lot of these victims come to the campus being themselves survivors of GBV or harassment, of sexual abuse, or so. Both boys and girls get abused sexually. And that thing lasts. It sometimes informs how they behave towards others, how they view their own place in the world, in society, etc., etc. So I think that it's important at some point, while we deal this big problem of gender-based violence by men against women, we also try to ensure that we balance the equation over time, or we keep one eye on the other side, as it were. But I think it's been great. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering when I was told two of the speakers they pulled out, I said, oh God, how are you going to do this? Actually, it's been really, I've learned a lot. And I thank you to Sana, thank you to all of you for this very engaging discussion. Nina, keep strong. I want to see you being that therapist who maybe defines the language for us. What's consensus? Get people to talk about, because it's so far from being defined. And that is a problem, because it's also an excuse that many people use, that there's been consent when there has not been consent, or when there's been different understanding of consent on both sides. And I think it's a discussion to be had. Congratulations for bringing it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you to all of you too.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.